Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation on befriending death with Dr. Saraliza Anzaldúa and Joanna Ebenstein. My name's Izzy. I am the Public Events Manager here at California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a nonprofit university in San Francisco. We're gathered in an online space. We're calling in from all over the world to learn from our presenters today, but we're all rooted in the land where we live and work. And we must honor those who came before us, the Indigenous stewards and caretakers of the lands that we call home. As a representative of CIIS, I want to honor and acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. CIS's campus is located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone. This land and the people are known as Yalamu in the Ramaytush language. If you're early in your journey and would like to learn more about Native lands, languages, territories, support organizations local to your area, we recommend the website native-land.ca as a starting point, and you can find that link in the event description below this video. Now, before we start, I want to go over a few general tips and troubleshooting items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight, so please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is also linked in the event description below this video. Our presenters will pull questions from that form after the conversation, and we'll try to get to as many as we have time for. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle on or off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat is enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see the chat. Chat is not required to fully experience the event, but if you choose to participate, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having trouble with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you still have issues, try adjusting your video settings within YouTube. Now, let me introduce our presenters, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Saraliza Anzaldúa is a Chicane philosopher from South Texas and an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness here at CIIS. Ya specializes in monster theory with an interest in metaphysics, phenomenology, and dehumanization, as well as Chicane and Mexican indigenous philosophy, with an interest in how process and place-based metaphysics give alternative paths for relating and healing. Aside from research, Ya is passionate about restorative justice in education through decolonized pedagogy and spreading philosophy as good medicine. Joanna Ebenstein is a Mexico-based artist, writer, curator, photographer, and graphic designer. She is the founder and creative director of Morbid Anatomy. Her books include Memento Mori, The Art of Contemplating Death to Live a Better Life, Anatomica, The Exquisite and Unsettling Art of Human Anatomy, and Death, A Graveside. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Joanna and Saraliza.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Joanna. I'm super excited to have this talk.
Me too. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I'd like to start with the basics. What is death and what meaning does it have for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. What is death? And I think my first answer is we don't know. And so to me, it is the great mystery of human life. And I think to me, that's what I find so compelling about it.
Yeah, there's definitely something that both attracts and repulses us about death. And I love how you just situate that in your book, how it really draws in the reader. And I'd like to hear, I mean, there's just so much to get into, right? And I think one just starting point is why you think death matters. Why should we care about death?
Yeah. I mean, to me, I don't see how death can't matter. Like I think, a story I tell in my book is when I was, as long as I can remember, people called me morbid because I've been interested in these things. Maybe some of you out there have had the same experience. And for the longest time, I just said, okay, yeah, I guess I'm a morbid person. But then one day I just began to think about it. And I thought, okay, if every single person who's ever lived has died, if everyone I know and love is going to die, if I, barring some medical miracle, will also die, then isn't it more morbid not to think about it? So I guess to me, I feel like looking at the historical record, it's been part of the human condition and the human experience, our arts, our philosophy, to think about death for all of human history, because it is this great mystery. It's something we live next to that defines our lives in certain ways, and certainly can change our lives in a flash. It's a profound part of everyday life. And I think there's something unbalanced and unhealthy in an individual and in a culture when they're not bringing this part of the life experience into their conscious awareness.
Most definitely, especially when you consider even at the peak of our life. I mean, our very cells are growing, but also dying. Just thousands and millions of things are dying inside us. Death is inextricably bound up with life.
Yes.
So why do you think that there has been this categorization of death, or even giving just the acknowledgement of death as something to be considered taboo, morbid, especially here in the US?
Yeah, I think the US is a particular case study. And I've traveled around the world, and I feel like there's nowhere I've seen that's as that pushes it away as completely as the United States. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think the United States is a newer nation. First of all, we're babies on the world stage. We're maybe like we're like teenagers, and teenagers don't think about their own death. But I think there's also this sense of a desire for positivity, and this desire to embrace what is good and what is pleasant, that I think many people who emigrated from other countries with difficulties chose to come to the United States and start over and start a better life, and a life that's free of the kind of hardships. And I think that is related to death as well. So I think there's something in the United States that it conflicts with our self-view and our kind of desire to endlessly self-create ourselves, and the belief that we can kind of do what we want with our will. And I think there's something about death, which is this great kind of slap in the face of it to our ambitions, right? Like it's we can invent amazing skyscrapers, we have incredible technology, but at the end of the day, we're going to die. And I think there's something about the United States in particular that is really attached to a worldview that can't accommodate that for some reason. And this might have to do with capitalism as well. I don't know. That's an idea that I've been wondering about, because I think it seems that in the United States, capitalism is the most entrenched of anywhere I've been. And to me, when I think of contemplating death, I think that is the enemy of a consumer lifestyle to some degree. If you're constantly thinking, if I die tomorrow, what do I want to do with my time on earth? It's probably not spending 80 hours a week at a job you don't like, right? In order to buy something. So I think there might be something about that too.
Most definitely. And just this idea that human possibility is infinite. And on that infinite, we can capitalize on it, that infiniteness of like, oh, anything's possible and we can achieve great heights. And death is very humbling. It is the great equalizer.
Exactly. Well said.
So that gets me thinking about, so you mentioned Mexico, and you live in Mexico currently, about different ways of relating to death around the world. Can you talk more about healthier alternatives in relating to death?
Yeah, for sure. So I got to know Mexico through a friend of mine, Salvador Olguin. I met him at my space in New York City, and he's from Monterrey, Mexico, but he was living in New York, and he started coming to events we were producing, and he started producing Day of the Dead events for us in New York, and then soon he started to lead trips to Mexico for Day of the Dead. And I went on all of these trips. As a matter of fact, our next one is coming up starting October 31st in Oaxaca. People can join if they wish. There's still tickets available. But this was really a life-changing experience for me. I had grown up in California, and I had not been to Mexico. I didn't know anything about Mexican. Well, it's not true. I knew about Day of the Dead because I was interested in death. And so when I saw the Oakland Museum did an exhibition about Day of the Dead many years ago, I volunteered as a docent, and that's when I really started to learn about it. But I think I was really changed by it by going to Mexico. And to me, I think there are many cultures that deal with death better than the United States, but Mexico is the one I know most intimately. And from my experience here, there's a way in which death is given a more complex reception or experience than it is in the United States. I feel like in the United States, we're kind of told, well, death is tragic and death is horrible and it makes you sad. And those things are true. And they're true in Mexico too, but there's also joy and there's also humor and there's also this sense of communing with returning family members that I've just found incredibly touching. And then also from being here and speaking to people of all different ages, I really get the sense, or at least I had the sense listening to people that, you know, maybe if I was born in Mexico, I might not be afraid of death the way I am in the United States. I think there is something about a different way of looking at it and a different culture that allows for death to be a part of everyday life that makes it less frightening.
There's that saying, los muertos viven hoy, the dead live today, meaning that the dead are with us. So you mentioned like communing with the dead, but we too are the walking dead. And I just love that idea that death is multiplicitous. It can be tragic, but it can be joy, and it can be in the past and present and future, and just weaving together that multiplicity. So I have so many questions.
That's okay, take your time.
I want to go, because we're on the topic of Mexico, and there's just so many rituals bound up with Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. What are your favorite rituals? Not only just surrounding commemorating the dead, communing with the dead, but also maybe daily rituals that you have, death practices.
For me, the simplest and the ritual that I engage in most often, and probably most people do, at least from the classes I've taught, I get the sense, is having an ancestor altar. So I'm in my office right now, I'm looking over, I have an altar that has many things on it, but among those things, it has images of my grandparents, a professor who was a mentor of mine who died recently. And yeah, exactly, right? They're a part of my life. And I think that is such a simple practice that anyone can do. And when I was in Mexico, I remember I went to a friend's house. He brought me to his mother's house where he grew up. And she had an ancestor altar, and he kind of saw me looking at it. And so he was explaining it to me. And he said, well, you know, whenever my mom is having a problem with like my sister or something like that, she lights a candle and talks to her mother. And I just think that's such a beautiful concept. It's so simple. And I think that, you know, whether we believe literally that we can speak to the dead, or there's an aspect in that which they live within us and we can access that wisdom, there's something that takes place there that I think is very beautiful and healing, and also keeping your loved ones as part of your process of living life, your daily life, you know, the prosaicness of everyday life, which I find very beautiful.
That is very beautiful. And I love that you still relate to one of your professors who was a dear mentor to you. We need to value our teachers. We need to value our lineages and our mentors, and that's quite beautiful. I love that they're on your altar.
Yeah, I think of them as chosen family and given, like birth family and chosen family, right? There are certain people that just resonate in you so deeply and change your life in a way that family does, right? A mentor is one of those people.
Most definitely, for sure. Well, this leads to my next question. You mentioned the like healing and relating aspect of honoring and relating not only to death, but to our dead. So can you talk a bit, you mentioned this in your book, about the need to engage with the shadow and what we can get out of it, and what impact it has for how we live our lives by engaging with that darker aspects that scare us.
Yeah. So throughout the book, I draw a lot on the thought and ideas of Carl Jung. It was very influential to me. I do Jungian analysis. I've been studying Jung for a long time, and I find his way of looking at the world, the one of all the modern thinkers I know that is most in harmony with the wisdom of the past that I found, the things that resonate for me in the past. And I learned about the concept of the shadow from him. And his idea of the shadow is that there's a part of ourselves that's in the light, which is our consciousness, what we know about ourselves. There's a part of us that is unknown, that's in this shadow. And this is true on an individual level, but also on a cultural level. And so the shadow is that which is not necessarily bad, but that which is denied, repressed, disdained, not looked at, right? And so, you know, what he talks about is how when you have an aspect of life, an archetype, for example, like death and life are kind of there are polarities on a continuum, right? And if you're going to give attention to life, you have to have just as much attention to death. And so by the United States putting all of their attention into life and avoiding death at all costs, right? There's a real imbalance. So culturally, there's an imbalance. And personally, I think there's an imbalance too. And I think when something is in the shadow, it becomes frightening. You know, I think this is part of why people are afraid of death, is because they're not looking at it. Because rather than say, okay, what is it I'm afraid of? What is it? What is death to me? What do I think about death? They're just pushing it away. And so we know from psychology, right? When we repress something, it doesn't mean it goes away. It just means it's not conscious. And once it's not conscious, it just becomes more frightening and has power over us. So I think for these reasons, it's really important. And when I say, what Jung would say too, is that the goal of analysis is not to make you like a better person or a, you know, a less, well, I guess a less neurotic person would happen naturally, but really it's about becoming whole. So it's about taking those things that are in yourself. And again, he would emphasize that the shadow is not necessarily bad. So it could be that in our family of origin, there was some element that is true to ourselves that are, you know, might benefit us a lot, but we pushed it down because it's not appropriate there. So the idea of Jungian analysis is kind of to become whole. It's to find your shadow through a descent into a symbolic land of the dead, I would say, a symbolic underworld, right? Find your shadow, befriend it, and bring it into your consciousness. And that makes us whole, and that also makes our culture whole. And so one thing that I think is really interesting about that is he believed that creators of all types, artists, writers, poets, are kind of naturally inclined to excavate that what's in the shadow as a way that heals our culture. So I wonder if that's why people like us, and I know a lot of other people out there, are interested in death right now, because it has become so gratuitously pushed away that the only way to create balance again is to bring it back. And I think intuitively, people who are dealing with the creative arts are at least some of them are drawn to these things and wanting to bring it back and maybe unconsciously create a more balanced culture or contribute to a more balanced culture.
Yeah, and you mentioned murals in your work and how that is a way for oppressed communities to use art as a way to memorialize their dead. And circling back to our earlier conversation about why death is taboo in the United States and engaging with that shadow, the United States has a long history of genocide, oppression, and there is this refusal to acknowledge that death, and often the dead are erased. They're not memorialized. And so artists have this really important role with remembering, communing with the dead, and etching that history when otherwise it would be erased. And that's another multiplicitous way of like engaging with the death. That sometimes it can be bittersweet, sometimes it can be regaining of the self. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on how using art as a medium to engage with the dead can, as you say, heal, can make us whole, can and pull that shadow and the light together.
Yeah, I think what you say is so interesting, and it made me think of like several different things while you were talking. So the first thing I thought about is what you said about disenfranchised communities. I think that's so important. One of the things, I think it made it into the book, I can't remember, that I think I talk about is I was hired by a university many years ago, like in 2009, to document memorial shrines in inner city Philadelphia. And they went with me into these neighborhoods that were that had seen a lot of violence. And you could see, because there were different sorts of memorials there. There were shrines that had been set up for the recently dead, often children, with people having lit candles, leaving toys and notes and cards, or sometimes it would be adults and then it would be not toys, but you would see all sorts of other things. And then sometimes these murals on the sides of buildings that were so beautiful. And I'm sure everyone has probably seen them. You see a portrait of somebody and their name is written in an artful text and some information about them there. And I really began to see these as like a kind of vernacular art from another part of US culture in which death is not distant. I think it's really important to say that for white affluent culture, death is taboo and distant. But in this culture, it's every day, and so when I was walking around photographing them, people would come up to me, sometimes quite angrily, and say, "What are you doing?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm here with this university." And they're, "Oh, okay. And then they'd say, "Well, let me tell you about this. This is my brother. This is my uncle. This is my cousin," and it really, really hit me. So just going back to what you're saying, just to affirm, yes. And then I also think, as you said, our country, the United States, is founded on genocide. That is not acknowledged. And as people try to acknowledge it more and more, there's more and more pushback. And I think there is something very haunted about a culture that can't look with clarity at its dead and it's what it did to be where it is. And I hope that's changing. But I don't think our culture can heal until it integrates its shadow, which is the fact that the lands that we prosper on were taken through killing and through unfair, at the very least, right? Unfair arrangements. And that it's not, I didn't learn about that until college. I don't know about you.
I mean, public education in Texas, you could probably guess.
Texas, yeah. But I was California and still.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And I think, as we've been discussing, this reluctance to acknowledge that's history is very much tied up with our inability to discuss death. And I love that word you use, the haunting, because we're haunted by our dead, and it's a specter that it's like a poltergeist. And
I love that.
And I think that the poltergeist is not only something that will make things chaotic, it'll make things dangerous, but in some cases, it's a type of possession, and it makes you just do unfathomable and unspeakable things. And I think very much our time is characterized with this inability to engage with death, with that shadow, and it possesses at least some so some people in power especially that they're unable to relate to other people, they're unable to relate to reality. And I think your project of helping people engage with death is such a good medicine. And I love how I have your book here. Just at the end of every chapter, there's ways to practically engage. Think about things that they learned, practices, ways to learn more, and it's just so accessible. Can you talk about some of your favorite practices, like in the book, that really just like either you spoke to you in such a way that you were like, I have to like let people know about this, or maybe a practice that you would recommend the people start with?
Well, thank you for pointing that out. To me, that was super important because I feel like as a reader, I've read so many books that have great content and somehow I'm excited, but it's like, if you ask me later what I read, I can't even tell you, like I personally like to have an activity that I do that helps me to synthesize and digest and make it my own so I can walk away and still have it as a part of me. So that was really important to me. And yeah, in the book, I put in all sorts of exercises that I have found really useful in my own life. One of the most simple that I recommend is just if you're struggling with trying to make a decision. Like, for example, when I said, I want to move to Mexico, but maybe that's crazy. I don't know. Instead of saying, what do I really want to do? I said, to myself, what do I want to do with my time on Earth? Is this what I want to do with my time on Earth? And it's a very simple addition, but to me, it creates, this is the beauty of contemplating death to me, right? By reminding yourself that there's a limit to time, and that there will be a time when you'll be on your deathbed, possibly with regrets, right? And that leads me to another question I often ask myself: would I regret on my deathbed having done this or not having done this? And I think that helps me when I'm in a situation where something is risky or feels a little frightening, which often are the things that help us grow, right? Those things that are slightly out of reach or feel a little bit uncomfortable. Those kinds of questions can really help clarify. Another of my favorite exercises comes from my friend, Mary. She's an artist that she's part of my matriarchal society club. And she told me about this beautiful thing she does with her children. So she says that there's all these ancestors that the children have never met. So once a month or whatever, they'll make a special dinner, and that dinner will be foods of a deceased ancestor really loved. They'll bring out photos, photo albums, and they'll talk about that family member with the child. So there's very, very simple things you can do that are fun and that are low-hanging fruit, I would say, and that I think can enrich your life.
I think those are all really amazing practices, and very accessible, because you also talk about things. So you use the example of funerals for the living to get into that space of, oh, what would it be like if I died? That are maybe less accessible. Funerals are expensive, even if it's just I'm gonna like lie down in this like wood coffin. Check the prices of plywood at your local hardware store. They've gone up.
Absolutely. No, yeah, for example, if money's no object, maybe you want to go to Mexico for Day of the Dead. But one of the things I offer as a kind of a second choice would be watching the movie Coco, which is one of my favorite films, the Pixar film about Day of the Dead, which I saw with my mom, who's never been to Mexico for Day of the Dead. And there's a scene where the camera's kind of coming in over the beautifully lit cemetery. And my mom leaned over and she whispered to me with excitement. She said, "Is that really what it's like?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly what it's like." Like, I think Lee Unkrich, the director, does a really magnificent job of capturing it. So there are things that are within reach. And many cities have their own Day of the Dead celebrations, especially in California and Texas probably too.
Sorry, I think my
okay.
camera froze for a little bit there.
Oh, no worries.
So I guess that leads to my next question, because you're talking about the variety of like death practices, and how even like Day of the Dead, it's not homogenous, right? They even vary between cities and regions. So how would you recommend? So as people go through the book, they're learning about these death practices, and you talk about how it's a very personal thing. It's a practice, a tradition that's tied to a community, tied to a lineage, but how you relate to the dead and to death is like a very personal thing. So how would you recommend people make things at their own? Where's the starting point? Where's like the inroad into those practices?
To create kind of your own practice of that sort? Is that what you, yeah. Well, again, I would go back to the ancestor altar. For me, that's just so simple and so easy. But there's a lot of exercises in the book that also will help you kind of find your way. So what I'm trying to do through the book is kind of help people to, over the course of introducing them to different concepts around death. And so each chapter is based on a different concept. So one is death with value. One is fear of death and the search for immortality. One is what happens after death. One is ancestors and their veneration, right? So each chapter kind of talks about different traditions in different times and places, and then has exercises, which some of them are thought experiments, some of them are saying, helping you kind of excavate your own understandings of or thoughts about death. And then from there, I think you can start to organically kind of find where it is that you want to heal, I guess, or create something that helps. I think everyone has, as you said, death is very personal, and our feelings about death are very personal. And I think everyone has a different, I should say everyone has a different, but there are differences in how we relate to it, and need to relate to it. And so I think for some people it can be very practical, so I try to have prompts for all sorts of people. So there's practical prompts, which is not really my path. I'm not that interested in the practical, but I think it's very useful for people. So for example, there's a form that my friend John Troyer, who works at the Center for Death and Society, created, which is basically something you can give your family and friends so they know what to do after you die. It answers all of these very, very practical questions. And I have death doulas who give advice about storing your passwords and giving them to people, all the practical elements. So that I think some people, that helps them feel more comfortable. For some people, it's more spiritual, I think, or psychological anyway, where you just kind of want to take a deep dive and say, if I can imagine death as a person, what might that look like? Would it be male or female? Would it be friendly or not friendly, right? All these kind of playful, imaginative exercises, a lot of which bring in the unconscious as well, because I really believe that when you're dealing with something as profound and unknowable as death, like the conscious mind can only get us so far, right? So I also encourage people to record their dreams, which is something that I found really useful, to write in a journal. So all of these different ways of honoring and working with the invisible realm, be that some people would consider that the realm of the spirit, some people would consider that the realm of the unconscious, right? But either way, I think for me, that's where the work needs to be done.
And I don't remember exactly your phrasing, but you wrote something like, do you feel it like in your spirit, in your heart? Is it helpful? Like, are you moved by this practice? And I love how, even though you make just so many paths available, no matter what path you're inclined to, but you started with the advice of like, you'll know when the path feels right. And that's the place to start.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's something that that our culture, also the United States in particular, somehow really makes us distrust our own observations and our own intuitions. And so much of my personal path that has brought me to writing this book has been learning to trust those things. And, for example, this is the work that I'm doing is countercultural, to say the least, right? It's not for everyone. But at a certain point, I think you start to know what is right for you. And it's interesting because this also leads to the idea of the psychopomp. So in the book, I talk about this idea of the psychopomp, which is Greek for soul guide. And it's a figure that leads you to death in different cultures. It could be a god, it could be an animal, it could be a shaman or a priest, right? But I feel like I had a conversation, and I worked this into the book, with a shaman that I know named Christina Pratt. And what she said that I think is really interesting, she said, people don't necessarily need a psychopomp. They need a psychopomp if they haven't lived the life that they're supposed to have lived with their time on earth. So from a shamanistic point of view, right? Each of us is born with certain gifts and certain skills and a passion that is supposed to tell us where we're supposed to be doing work, what we're supposed to be doing. And if all goes well and we're able to follow that passion and use those skills and do the things that it was our life's purpose to do, we can die in peace with no unfinished business and not need a psychopomp to lead us over. It's the people that have not managed to do that are the ones who need help and guidance. And what I find really interesting about that is speaking to death doulas. My husband is a death doula, and he says that they say that, so a death doula, for those who don't know, is kind of like a midwife of death. They're secular figures that help the dying to transition, and they help the loved ones of the dying as well, often. So they say that when people are having problems with death and letting go, the problems usually fall under 4 different categories, which would be regret, unfinished business, guilt, or shame. And what's interesting is I was just interviewed by a medium on her podcast, And she said it's the same for how she thinks about people who return to speak to the living are, that they come back because of those things. So there's this, and this is how we've thought of ghosts for many traditions as well too, right? So I think, and coming back full circle to what you were saying earlier about, I loved what you said about, you know, the fact that there's a poltergeist in the United States, but I think it's very much about, like, think of all of the unfinished business that the dead died with, you know. And so again, if we want to think about it literally or metaphorically, I think there's a lot to chew on there.
Oh, for sure. And there's so many ways that various communities and cultures will imagine like the ripple effects of that guilt, that regret, that shame, um, from the kind of like innocuous of disturbed sleep, nightmares to the very horrifying like Japanese ghosts, the yuri, the revenge ghosts that have unfinished business. And it's just interesting to think about that. Uh, and since you brought up psychopomp, what are some of your favorite death figures?
I have one big death figure that's my absolute favorite. I'll end on that one. I love Persephone. That was probably the first one I really, Persephone, who's the queen of the underworld in the Greek tradition, is one of my favorites. Try to do another one. Well, I'll just launch into what I love. So I end the book with a discussion of my favorite death figure right now, which is returning to Mexico. It's Santa Muerte. And so for people who have the video on it, I brought one along. So this is Santa Muerte. She is many describe her as a psychopomp. She is a folk saint here in Mexico. She's been around for, people say, maybe since the 18th century. It seems like she came to prominence at least around NAFTA. Some people call her the NAFTA saint. She is seen, as you can see here, I think it really captures the fact that she's seen as beautiful and also at least at times as generative, right? The fact that she's pregnant, I don't know if you can see that, but she's a pregnant Santa Muerta, which I think is really amazing. And so in 2022, she was cited as having 12 million followers. And I've been told that since COVID's effects, it's gone up even more. But I think it's a really remarkable, if we want to talk in a Jungian sense, right? Coming from this idea, coming from the collective consciousness or the collective unconscious, this image bubbles up that is like a compensatory image of death. So if we think of the Grim Reaper and we think of a male, punitive, he's got his scythe and he's going to come in and he's going to mess your life up, right? He's going to take you from life. That's not the sense we got with Santa Muerta, right? She's a feminine figure. She's seen as a loving mother. She's also seen as someone who leads you to the next world. And yeah, I just think she's fantastic.
And I love how in the book you talk about, well, maybe you could talk more about misunderstandings about the figure. And
yes, yeah. I've had people get upset when I mentioned Santa Muerte. And I have to say, there's a point when I was like, I knew I wanted to write about her, but the only image I have in the book is a photograph of her, because I feel that I could write anything I want, but until you see the photo of how she really is, you can't really understand how different the perspective of death that could create something like this is from our own, you know? But yeah, I've gotten some pushback when I talk about Santa Muerte in a positive way, and people say, oh, well, you know, she's the narco saint, and she's the, you know, she's the saint of drug dealers and murderers. And I have a good friend named Eva Aridis Fuentes who did a film about Santa Muerte that she shows for my classes. And in the Q&A, these topics would come up. And she had a really brilliant response that I, with her permission, put in the book, which she said, well, you know, all mafiosa might be Catholic, but it doesn't mean that all Catholic people are mafiosa. And it's the same with Santa Muerte, you know, and that's very much been my experience here in Mexico. I have visited many shrines. I have spoken to people who said that they had very difficult lives, and she helped them get off the streets and all sorts of things. So again, going back to this idea of monolithic, right? I don't think it's a monolithic cult. I think that, yes, I believe that narcos do venerate Santa Muerte, but so do cops, and so do taxi drivers, and so do moms, and so do trans people, and all sorts of individuals. And what's so interesting is when I say trans people, she is also kind of a patron saint for those whom the traditional church does not accept, because as you said earlier, death is the great equalizer, right? Death accepts everyone regardless of what they did in life. And so unlike the Virgin Mary, who might be like, you're a criminal, or you're a sex worker, or a homosexual, she accepts all of those people. And so there's something very beautiful about that as well.
And something, so you mentioned that she's generative, she's depicted as a mother. There's something that ties into the transformative aspect of death, because death is not the end, although it can be an end. It's a phase in a longer transition. Things grow, they decay, they die, but then they get incorporated and regenerate again. And so it's a really process. And I think Santa Muerte really encapsulates that process, and people in between transitions, between the cracks of society, they get left out because they don't fit a particular normative model that we find more in traditional death figures like the Grim Reaper or Catholic saints.
Yeah, I think everything he says is absolutely true. And there was something I wanted to add, and now, of course, I lost it. Sorry.
I'm sure it'll come back. I mean, there's just so much I want to talk to you about.
Yeah, well, this material is so rich and it goes in so many directions that it's always, oh yeah, I know what I want to say. I wanted to kind of piggyback on what you were saying and what you're talking about, which I think is so true and so beautiful, is this idea of kind of cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And that's a chapter in the book as well. And I think what's really interesting about that is, for most cultures in all of human history, death was not an end. You know, the scientific models, death is an end. But for most other mythological understandings, I have not found one in which death is just, that's it, kaput, you know? So I think this idea of an end is a very culturally specific one, and part of what creates the fear as well.
Yeah. And so I would love to hear you talk about that. Like, what are some of the traps that people fall into when they think about death?
Yeah, well, what I find surprising in a lot of the students that come my way is they seem to assume that science has proven that when we die, that's the end. And, you know, the stranger and more exciting truth is science has not proven that. Science has not proven the opposite, but we still don't know, you know, which is kind of remarkable. So to me, I guess that maybe the best way to say it is, what I'm hoping this book will help people do is kind of start with the beginner's mind, you know, and forget all the things we think we know, because really there's very little we know. You know, we know about the bodily processes and we know about some scientific aspects, but there's so much that is unknown, and that can be frightening. And to some people, I think it is, but it can also invoke curiosity and excitement, I think, you know. And that reminds me, I remember, I think I worked this into one of the exercises. There was a point in my life where I was invited to be a nanny in New York City, and I was really scared. And I said that to the woman who was going to hire me, and she was a psychologist. I said, well, you know, excitement and terror are basically the same thing physiologically. It's how your brain parses it. And so that's something I think about too. I think there is an element where we can try to look with curiosity and interest rather than just fear. Even if there's fear there, also maybe being open. That's what I'm hoping this book will help people do. Be curious. And in my experience, being curious often trumps fear.
Especially when it comes to being open to alternative ways of being. So we talked earlier about how this kind of obsession with life and purity and the self, which a lot of modern science is rooted in, that kind of European Enlightenment will to power model. So for them, yeah, baby death is the end. But for a lot of other ways of being in multiplicity, it's just another phase and the multiple transitions we'll go through.
Yeah. Yeah. And for many of our ancestors, it was seen as a rite of passage, you know, that's rather than an end. And I think that's A, I think that's a beautiful way to think about it. B, so Carl Jung talks about, this idea of archetypes. So archetypes are things that exist in all cultures, or are expressed in all cultures. And life, death, and rebirth is one of those archetypes. Not death as an end, but life, death, and rebirth. It's something we see in cultures all around the world. And I think that's really interesting. And there's something else I want to say about that. I'm so sorry, I lost my thought. But of course, we also see it in the cycles of nature, right? We see, plants die in the winter and they're reborn in the summer. We see a caterpillar go into a chrysalis and become a butterfly. There's all these examples of the cyclical nature of life. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. Jung and his followers also said, and I think this is super interesting, that the psyche, when they've had analysins who are dying, the dreams that these analysins have indicate a moving of location and not an end also. So often people, and I've heard this, that hospice workers say this as well, when people start dreaming about having their luggage to go on a voyage, you know that they're going to die soon. So this is the imagery that the psyche is creating. It's not creating an end. It's creating all of these images of a continuation. So again, we can't know factually if we go on after death, but there's every indication that our psyche, our deeper psyche, believes that that's the case. Isn't that interesting?
That is, and that's really quite beautiful. So of all the myths and stories, the narratives that you've encountered, what's your favorite, or what are some of the things that stand out to you?
I guess for me, I go back again to the story of Persephone. Of all the myths that I've encountered, that is my favorite. So the story of Persephone is that some of you are probably already familiar with it. She's a young woman. She's a maiden. She doesn't have a real name. Her name is just Maiden. She's the daughter of Demeter, who's the goddess of grain and fertility. And she's picking flowers in a meadow one day with her friends, and suddenly the ground opens up and the god of death emerges in a chariot drawn by 4 horses, and he grabs her and he drags her down to the underworld. And then her mother travels the world trying to find her and save her, and Zeus won't do anything about it because he doesn't care. It was, in fact, he condoned it, and that's a whole other story. But she decides she's going to take revenge, and so she stops tending to the fertility of the plants. And so the gods start to be upset because now people aren't making offerings anymore. So Zeus has to come in and he has to create a compromise. So he says, okay, she can come back. But, well, there's many different myths, but the most common myth says that, unfortunately, because she had eaten some pomegranate seeds in the underworld, she couldn't leave completely. But her fate is that for a certain time out of the year, she needs to be in the underworld, being the queen of the dead. And for a certain time, she's on earth with her mother. And when she's in the underworld, it's winter in Greece. And when she is up in the upper world, it's the seasons in which we have vegetation in the world. And then that becomes also the basis for these mystery religions. So there's a mystery religion called the Eleusinian Mysteries that are based on that, where some people think that through possibly a psychedelic brew. But it seems very compelling to me from what I've read. It's not been proven, but there's a ritual. It's like 2 days long, and people are given this immersive experience of a life, death, and rebirth that seem to, in a similar way that near-death experiences do, cure people of their fear of death. So it was a ritual that was part of Greek culture for centuries that helped people with this, which I think is just remarkable.
That's very interesting. And I find it fascinating that we're talking about nuances of death and like multiplicity. That Persephone myth is very multiplicitous. So it's been interpreted in so many ways. So there's the transformative cyclical aspect, but there's also violence and finding one's agency and power post-trauma, post-violence. There is the idea that one can heal and grow after violence until, of course, the next cycle of violence comes, which everyone can relate to, the feeling of, can there be life after violence? Can there be life after trauma? Can we heal from all that? And so there's just so much in that myth to experience, to think through. And
sure. Yeah, and to feel into it. As you said, like I think there's so many ways to enter it and to see where it might resonate for you, but also, you know, after this violence, she's transformed. She's no longer maiden, she's Persephone, the queen of the dead. So not only did it transform her, but it gave her her adult power and status. And I've also heard the interpretation that I really like, that maybe she wanted to be queen of the dead because she was worried about them and she thought they were lonely and it was miserable down in Hades, which I think is a really lovely way of looking at it as well.
Which reminds me, it brings me back to Santa Muerte, and well, there's contention in scholarship whether these two figures are together, but Mictlantecuhtli, the Lady of the Dead in Mexica culture, that is more of a kind of motherly, soft figure that sees the dead not just as kind of like, okay, you're dead. Let me assign you to a place based on how you lived your life, but as people to care for. They're still entities, they're still people that have spirit, that have heart, and that deserve care. They deserve dignity.
Yeah. No, I think it definitely, and whether Santa Muerte literally brings in that goddess, there are goddesses like that she's incorporating, and I would argue that one too. I mean, I think what's interesting about that too is it makes me think of kind of the great mother goddesses that many scholars believe preceded patriarchal religions, in which all of these different attributes were combined into one figure. So life and death, pain and pleasure, birth and fertility and rebirth and all of these things. And when Eva Arides Fuentes was talking about Santa Muerte, she basically said she's the goddess of love, of luck, of protection, of everything, essentially. And that really made me think of the great mother goddess, and that maybe, and here we are with this pregnant figure, right? That it does seem to be some sort of a return to a more holistic divinity that is able to embrace and integrate all of these things that we have separated out in our culture that weren't always separated out, I don't think, in the same way, or not vilified and, one side lionized and one side vilified the way it is now. So I wonder if she isn't a return to that earlier figure that we need now.
Yeah, definitely. That integrates the complicated, just multiplicitous ways that life happens, because it's not always pure, right? So even in moments of joy, there are moments that are tinted with sadness, and there's that whole story of, well, it's from Chinese philosophy, where a horse farmer loses the horse, but the horse brings back another horse, and his son is training the horse, but the son falls and breaks his leg, but then doesn't have to go to war. And so it's always from the good, there's a seed of bad, and from the bad, there's always like a seed of good. And I think Santa Muerte very much encapsulates that multiplicitous, because life is just interwoven with so much complexity. And this kind of false myth we've been given that no, you can have pure life and you can have it all and you can be at the top and you can be immortal and like live forever through your fame and your fortune. I think more people are waking up to, oh, that's not how things work.
Yeah, and not only is it a false myth, but it's a damaging myth, right? It's like there's something so much more forgiving about a figure that encompasses everything and more true to our lived experience. And I think the kind of Judeo-Christian model we've inherited is not great for most people's self-esteem or psyche. It's very hard to live up to those ideals. Then again, Santa Muerte accepts you whether you live up to those ideals or not, which I think is very beautiful.
Very much so. So I guess one final question I have, before we move to the Q&A, is thinking how I want to phrase it. So when you're exploring the shadow, you inevitably will have that sort of dark night of the soul, right? You hit that obstacle, that wall, you're like, oh, maybe I do want to go back. Maybe this forest is too dark. Maybe the status quo is just what I have to be satisfied with. Do you have any advice for people who are reading your book, are going through these practices and encounter that wall? What would you tell them?
That's a great question. What helped me was reading other narratives of other people who did it. And I think in a way, that's what the myth of Persephone is about too, is this descent into the underworld and facing something very dark and then emerging. Knowing that others have done it before you and come out with enriched lives. And for me, just reading those narratives. So I was reading a Jungian book, or several different Jungian books, which just talked about different analyses going through this, because it is a part of the process of Jungian analysis and having faith. And the other thing I would say is, you know, and one of the exercises I have in the book too, is thinking about your own cycles of life, death, and rebirth you've had in your past. And all of those times when you've thought, I mean, at least I have, I'm sure most of you have too, had an experience where you thought, oh my God, oh, this is the end. I can't even believe, right? Something so terrible. But then for me, when I look now back with many years between that, I was like, wow, I wouldn't have done this or this or this if that hadn't have happened. You know, these things that just seem so disastrous often, you know, become the life, death, and rebirth cycles in our own lives. Being fired from a job, breaking up with someone, these things that can be so devastating. But then something happens and you realize you would not be who you are today without having gone through that. So I think those are the things I find comfort in. But I would also say if people are really struggling psychologically and they feel like this is too much for them, then you know your own limits, and maybe it's not time to do that at that point, you know?
Yeah, because I don't, I think especially in terms of personal journey, mental health, we think, okay, you know, I'll do like a 6-week program and then I'll come out better at the end and that'll be it. But that's not how things these complex works. It's something that you probably would be working on for years, decades, maybe your whole life. And I love that you bring in like community, learning from other people's journeys. You mentioned your mentors, and so having not only strength in other people's stories, but finding other people to share that similar journey with, and finding those people
Yes.
to learn from.
I think that's a great point. And finding people in your life that support the you that is the truest you, and that help you have the courage to do the things you need to do, I think is a really wonderful thing. Finding truly like-minded people and people that aren't making you think that you can't do certain things. Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, and your website, Morbid Anatomy, brings in so many people to learn from. Just it's its own community of like-minded individuals. Can you talk about some of the things
Yeah.
that you offer, some of the things you're working on? You've mentioned documentaries.
Yeah, so Morbid Anatomy is a project I've been doing since 2007, and it's taken many forms over the years. Right now, we're mostly online, and the thing that I'm most proud of is I call it Morbid Academy. We have a school essentially with really wonderful professors from all over the world who are teaching not just about death, but about death too, but about all sorts of things that I feel like things that fall between the cracks, things that people tend not to take seriously, things that are maligned often. So what I really feel like our vision is openness and rigor. We bring in professors or teachers, sometimes they're practitioners, sometimes they're professors, who approach their material with an openness and a curiosity, but also a rigor, a groundedness. So yeah, we do these online classes. I teach one actually based on this book that people can sign up for. So since the book is a 12-week book, I'm doing it over 12 weeks, but 6 classes. So we'll skip so people can read along and we can discuss and be a part of community. And as you said, that community aspect really is one of the most beautiful things about Morbid Anatomy. At this point, pretty much once we went online, which was right at the beginning of the lockdown, we began to meet like-minded people around the world. And a lot of people at that point, as we can remember, right, we're starting to think about death in a new way. So we started to attract people. Of course, there are some people who during that time wanted nothing to do with it, but there are some people who said, okay, let's look at this. Let's try to, I don't want to say make lemonade from the lemons, but, use this as an opportunity rather than just something to hide from. And that's really a lot of what the morbid anatomy community is. I think there are people who are seeking greater meaning than the straightforward scientific world provides us. It doesn't necessarily mean they're believers in anything, but rather they're just curious about what other ways there are of looking at the world. And that might be cultural traditions, it might be dream work, it might be a Jungian approach. So there's all these different currents going on in our online classes. We also do trips around the world. So we do our annual trip to Mexico for Day of the Dead. We have the next one starting on October 31st. We have a trip coming up in Savannah, Georgia as well. And these are all led by local people that have a special connection to the place. We do online lectures every Monday. We have a Patreon as well, where I write articles and commission other articles. And we put videos from our weekly lecture series up there. So we've got lots of different things. Oh, and in Brooklyn, New York, if anyone happens to be there, we have an open to the public research library. It's free. It's open every weekend. It's kind of a little museum as well. It's got memorial objects and Santa Muerte figures and all sorts of things I've collected from all over the world. So definitely check that out if you're in New York.
It's really interesting. I love that. Being an academic professor, I'm a bookworm.
Me too.
If I can throw in like one extra question before we get to the
Yeah.
Q&A, what are some of your favorite books
In the
about
library?
death? Yeah.
I would say a book that was super influential for me, if people are interested in kind of an overview of cultural history of death, there's a book by Philip Aris, a French academic, which is like the intellectual of history of death, and it's called The Hour of Our Death. It's a book stopper of a book, or a door stopper of a book. It's huge, but it's the book that really helped me create a scaffold on which to put everything else I've learned. It's just incredible scholarship. There's also a book I love called Wisconsin Death Trip. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
No.
It's an amazing book. It's so strange. It was an art project, and it's a collection of photographs and newspaper clippings from 19th century Wisconsin that shows a totally different Victorian world than we ever thought existed. It's just an incredible thing. Trying to think of other things that stand out. Those are the first two that come to mind.
Oh, I love.
Please come to the library.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to visit. I love the idea of the second book, because I think there is this problem of homogenizing in academia. I want to learn about romanticism. Okay, so you read a book and then you get that one idea about what romanticism is. And I'm always very interested in books that are like, actually, over here this was going on, and over here this was going on. So just filling in the mosaic.
No, absolutely. And going back to what we were saying about complexity, right? It's like we want to have this monolithic view of the past, and I love these things that puncture the possibility of us ever even understanding it, and going back to my mentor, who is Mel Gordon, who's on my altar right now. His philosophy, he was a writer as well, and his philosophy, what he would always tell students is, don't read history books, go to contemporary sources and do your own research. And that's how he created a whole career of finding different stories than anyone else was telling.
That's very beautiful.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah.
So there are a couple questions in the Q&A. The first question, are there any somatic practices for processing grief and loss that you've come across in your research?
For me, meditation and yoga have been the things that have helped me. It's not specifically about grief and loss, but I feel like moderate, from my experience, it's amazing how powerful just changing your breathing is about the feelings that you're having and the sense of being able to live with them, For me, yoga is the practice I do the most that really helps me in a way that I can't even put my finger on how, because I think it is non-rational. but it helps me integrate grief very much.
Mm. You mentioned just tapping into that unconscious and how the unconscious influences your work. And we don't recognize that a lot of what's going on, we're so caught up in what's going on in the frontal, we don't realize actually the majority of what's going on in our body is unconscious. It just is, it's going along on its own journey. And to take a moment to pause in our busy lives, to breathe through that and like, oh, actually, there's a lot of stuff going on. It can be very healing and just creating that sense of awareness.
Absolutely.
Next question. I experience anticipatory grief for those I love. Sometimes I wish I could be more present rather than preemptively grieving people. Do you have any advice for me?
That's tough. For me, what helps me when I'm having experiences that are similar is just to express my feelings for those I love as much as possible, to let them know I'm thinking about them, to enjoy my time with them, knowing that, like all things, it won't happen forever, and just appreciating it as much as you can.
I love that. I think we all have those moments, and sometimes,
Yeah, for sure.
especially, transitioning to bed, trying to sleep, and those intrusive thoughts come up. And I imagine catastrophes happen. I will wake up my partner just to say, I love you so much. Thankfully, he is one of those people that as soon as his head hits the pillow, he can fall back asleep. So it's not a problem for him.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. And I know a lot of people, it's a common deathbed regret to people say, I wish I'd said I loved you more.
Have you noticed shifting attitudes towards death between generations?
I definitely have noticed a shifting attitude now, which I think is amazing. Like when I started doing Morbid Anatomy in 2007, I didn't even use my real name. It started as a blog, and I was in children's publishing at that time. And I was like, oh, they knew that I was doing this. Within a few years, that changed. And now I feel like it's much more normalized than it was. There's still times when people say, what do you do? And I take a deep breath and I start, and sometimes I watch their face just fall. But I do think that this generation of young people are more interested in green burials and other alternatives to how they want to die, how they want to be buried. They are agitating for changes in the law. There's a lot of young people who are becoming death doulas now, which is something I find really interesting. A lot of people that I meet want to become a death doula. This was not the case. I mean, I didn't even know what a death doula was 10 years ago, but now it's pretty common, at least in my circles. So I think part of this is post-COVID too. I think things have really changed a lot. And I think the book that I wrote wouldn't have even been feasible before COVID. So I think the landscape is changing and people are starting to acknowledge death, whether we like it or not, in a different way.
What are your self-care practices while dealing with a recent death?
Yoga, writing in my journal, babying myself. That's another thing, is when I feel, to the extent that I can, if all I want to do is read in bed or take a bath or not talk to anyone, I allow myself to do that. I try to create as much space for what my body and my psyche want, without my criticizing it or saying, no. Taking your time and not being rushed and not being told that, not allowing yourself to believe that there's a right way or a wrong way, that it's personal, and trusting yourself and knowing that that your body and your mind, your psyche, have desires that can possibly be very helpful.
I love that. And I think that ties into it. You mentioned mourning practices and grieving in the book, and how it's important to have that. And a lot of people, they don't have that luxury. It's a privilege to be able to take that period It's like, okay, you've attended the funeral, back to work, back to the status quo. And so giving yourself that gift of mourning, allowing
Yeah.
yourself to grieve is super important.
Yeah, and even if you have to go back to work, then you come home and you don't do anything you don't want to. You eat whatever you want. You watch 6 hours of TV if that's what you want, just whatever it is, like I think for me, that's what I struggle with, is a voice in my head that's very critical and wants me to be, so I think everyone has their own thing, but for me, that's, I err on the side of babying myself.
I come from a place where there's the death penalty. How might a death doula assist those on death row? How would you approach death in this case?
Well, what a death doula does is they work with someone to help them accept their death and help them. Another thing they do that I think is really wonderful is something called the legacy project. So often, especially if someone has a sense of not having a clear sense of what their life was for, or that their life had value, there are different projects you can do, an oral history, for example, or a photo album, or an autobiography, or even kind of coming up with what you did in your life and kind of trying to find meaning in the life you had, and to deal with those, again, those 4 categories of things that might be holding you back from a peaceful death. So that would be regret, unfinished business, guilt, and shame. So I think all of those things could be done with someone on death row, with a compassionate, and the other thing that a death doula does is they engage in what's called deep active listening. So basically it's non-judgmental listening, where you just kind of create a container for someone else to express themselves. So I think all of those things could be something very valuable to someone who was on death row.
How do you cultivate joy while grieving? What do you think of how somber and sad funerals are? For example, some cultures even hire mourners, and it's quite a concerted effort to be sad.
I think grief and sadness is real and an important part of grieving, but I think also is joy. So one of the things I talk about in the book is the New Orleans jazz funeral, and I don't know if people are already familiar with that. So these are they're processions where you have musicians in the front playing. It starts with really sad music and it ends with uplifting music at the end, and it's like a cathartic experience for everyone. So there's tears moving to joy and laughter. So I think there are ways to bring respectful joy into grief. It need not mean that grief doesn't exist, but that it allows for, I also think of an Irish wake, right? Like when people cry and then tell jokes, and it's all of it. It's the big mess of human emotion. I think there are certain rituals, not ours, but certain rituals that do allow for those.
And going back to what you mentioned in the book about finding a path that feels right, giving space to that very complex, multiplicitous experience. I've seen things online where people they hire like professional comedians to roast them at their own funerals.
Oh, I've not heard of that. That's amazing.
And I saw something where an elderly person, like in the last time preparing for their death, they made little Ouija boards for their funeral participants to commune with them at the funeral, which I thought was absolutely lovely.
That is really cool. I love that.
It sometimes feels like there are 2 ways to experience the fear of death, the fear of your own death, and the fear of your loved one's death. I experience them quite separately. How would you relate the 2? Is there a way to integrate them to process the fear?
I don't have a quick and easy answer for that one. I would advise writing about it, in your journal, writing about what both of those things mean, and then maybe underlining some key words and seeing if there's places they connect, that I would try to come up with an activity. I don't know. I haven't thought that through. I'm sorry.
It reminds me, so often we'll do things for other people that we wouldn't do for ourselves, or we'll do things for ourselves that we wouldn't normally do for the other people. And I think it's a very interesting question to think about, that kind of shift in position when we think about death. Next question is from Sandrine. My uncle is currently dying of cancer and has chosen the process of euthanasia. in Canada to transition. I've never experienced the loss of a loved one through euthanasia. Do you have any advice for me?
Well, I think if I was in your position, I know it would be difficult if I loved that person and didn't want that to happen, but I would try to respect their decision and know that it came from a place of probably great pain that they don't feel they can tolerate anymore, and try not to take it personally. And the other thing that I've heard death doulas say is that often it's hard, like the people who are dying are ready to go, but it's the loved ones who don't want them to go. And that sometimes the dying stick around consciously or unconsciously because they don't feel that they have the permission to go, really. So I think if I was in your position, even though it would be, I would try to put myself in, understand where they were coming from, and understand that their decision had nothing to do with me, but came from a place of where they're at and what they need.
No, I think that's very good advice. I can't imagine being faced with that just that monumentous experience and having that be out of my hands. There's nothing to do, right? Because especially here in the United States, we're like, no, my will, my conscious mind can overcome any obstacle, and to be so helpless in that, I think that's very sound advice. And thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
With so much death happening around the world, like genocide and war, it feels like there's a constant air of death and it feels hard to process. How do you advise people to process it, since it's not a personal death, but a mass public death?
Yeah, that collective grief. I mean, it's real, and we're all living with it. And again, I kind of go back to yoga and some sort of somatic experience that you have that allows you to go inward and to be in yourself. And I mean, there's nothing we can, at least my feeling is, beyond voting in certain ways, there's very little we can do to change this fact. I mean, another thing that I think of in a rational way is that people have lived with death and horrors for so long. There's nothing different for us going through it. It's the human condition, or at least the patriarchal human condition, It doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean I like it, but it means that it's part of the landscape of being a human being right now for every single human being who has access to the news, I mean, the other thing I would say, I think it's okay not to watch the news all the time. That's that decision I made a long time ago when I realized that it was just freaking me out and upsetting me and undermining my ability to function well in the world. I cut myself off, and I don't do that very much anymore. So if that's what you need to do, that's okay too. Whatever you need to do to live in this world.
And going back to, I think it might have been the first question about how different generations relate to death. I think in taking that moment to go inward to process how you would normally grieve, I think can lead to good medicine. So shifting our relationship to death, which will put us on the path of where we can make that difference, where we can, whether that be in our own communities or beyond our own communities. Because once we engage with that shadow, once we shift our relationship to death, it's going to have ripple effects.
For sure. And I think there's something I wanted to add, and I'm trying to figure out how to say it. There's there's a perspective that looking at the history, a bigger history gives one. And I think that looking at the history of death and the way different people have dealt with it in different times and places, for me, has helped me see things in a different way, where although it might be painful, it's not overwhelmingly painful, because I see it more in the context of world history and in a way, I feel like the historical lens is almost like in a way what religion helped people do before. Just like it's a bigger picture that helps you see. I think it's so easy to get so caught up in our everyday lives and not step back. And when we're in it, it's just it's a constant whirlwind all around us. You know what I mean? So whatever way you have of stepping back and feeling calm, and being able to take in a bigger picture in which we see today's situation in a larger context.
As a way into seeing where we can shift our relationships, where we can make a difference. You mentioned yoga, you mentioned meditation, just finding that center, finding that stillness.
Yeah, whatever that is for you. I mean, that's what it is for me. Some people it's dancing, or singing. Some people it's running, like I think it's really about finding what works for you.
Last question. Is there anything that is particularly interesting in your research at the moment, or that you're most excited to look into?
That's a great question to end on. Right now, I'm actually researching my next book, which is about the art of fairy tales, and that's really fun. And it's been there's a lot of shadow and darkness and monsterology in the fairy tale. So I've been kind of going into witches, Baba Yaga, the cultural history of fairy tales, which I find super, super fascinating. So kind of the history of folklore and oral traditions. So that's where my passion is at the moment, is oddly fairy tales.
And there's so much there to unpack, right? Especially in terms of the shadow and death.
Oh my God, there's so much. It's so rich. It just goes like death. It goes, it's an ancient tradition. It's just, it boggles the mind.
And every culture and tradition has their own like folk tales, fairy tales. And I feel like you get the multiple lifetimes and never even get close to scraping the bottom.
Absolutely. It's humbling because even I can't even learn the Western tradition. I'm a late comer to this materials, but it's incredibly fascinating.
Well, is there anything you would like to say to our audience before we close out?
Well, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you for your interest in this material. And I hope if you are interested in this, that the book is useful to you. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for your wisdom. And I hope that this is good medicine for everyone who sees this and reads your book. Thank you, everyone. I'm wishing everyone a good night.